Welcome to the Megillah Project.
One story, many angles.
Come learn with us.
A sinister Esther, a demonic Mordekhai, confronting Purim's divine and human shadows through Kabbalah. The book of Esther is a very atypical book in the Tanakh. People have wondered throughout the ages how exactly to read it. In recent years, people have taken more literary approaches to it, but this hasn't really solved the conundrum of how to read the book. Here are two possible ways to read it. Conventionally, two of the different literary possibilities are to read it as tragedy, although a tragedy barely averted but barely averted, or as satire, comically played. I want to propose now an alternative to both of these, or to take elements of both of these, that the book of Esther and the Purim story is marked by a very disturbing doubling, an uncanny doubling between good and bad. And if we take it into the realm of Kabbalistic mythology, into the realm of divine and demonic. So I'm going to take you through some of the main characters in the story, specifically Mordechai and Esther, show how they're doubled, and then show how Kabbalistic texts take that doubling into realms you might not have imagined until it affects even the divine itself, even God, even the divine realm. And that's why I put as my first image in this lecture this painting by Rossetti from the 19th century, How They Met Themselves. Seems to show two couples meeting in a wood, but in fact it's only one couple meeting their double. How they met themselves, and what happens, what kind of uncanny disturbance happens when one finds oneself doubled, perhaps parodied, perhaps cruelly parodied by the identical, by the twin, but the twin from the other side. As I say, I'm going to look at the two main characters, or two of the main characters in the book, which are Mordechai and Esther. So let's first take Mordechai. Now, Mordechai's main enemy in the Megillah, in the book of Esther, is Haman. There is a peculiar passage in the Talmud, as interpreted by Rashi, the great medieval French commentator on the Talmud, about Haman and Mordechai, taking off from a verse early in the book, in one of the first banquet that the king Ahasuerus holds. And it says in the text, and the drinking was according to the law, none did compel. For so the king had appointed to all the masters of his house that they should do according to the will of man and man, usually translated to the will of each man. But Rava said, a Talmudic sage, what does it mean to do according to the will of man and man? Kiratzon ish va'ish. He says to do according to the will of Mordechai and Haman. Very strange comment by Rava. And whatever Rava meant himself, we have this comment by Rashi. The will of Mordechai and Haman, in other words, taking off from Rava's comment, he says they were the ministers of the drinks at the banquet. Mordechai and Haman had the same job under King Ahasuerus, and that was to be the Sarei Mashke, the ministers of drinks. Now, this is stated nowhere in the text. It's some tradition, who knows where it comes from. Rashi doesn't explain what it means or what its significance is. Mordechai and Haman were both ministers of drinks. What are we to make of this? Why this notion that they have the same job in the royal court? And here I want to turn to the Zohar. The Zohar is the main work of Kabbalah, written in Spain, mostly at the end of the 13th century in Aramaic. And I'm going to turn to a passage that doesn't mention Purim or Esther, the book of Esther, explicitly, but which I think sheds great light on our passage here. And here it is. This is from the Zohar. And the Zohar is very concerned, as is much of later Kabbalah, with saying that the world is divided into divine and demonic sides. entire realms, divine and demonic. And yet the Zohar, as well as later Kabbalah, goes to great lengths to say that these two sides are almost indistinguishable in appearance. And here is one of the places where it says this. As it is on the side of holiness, palaces and ministers, all for good, holy spirits and holy dimensions, so it is on the side of impurity, palaces and ministers, all for ill, and impure spirits, and all impure dimensions. And this corresponds to this, and all stands in one mystery. These mirror images, the divine and the demonic, holiness and impurity, both have palaces and ministers, spirits and dimensions. And this corresponds to this. In Aramaic, it's vida lakabel da. Almost indistinguishable, actually indistinguishable words used for the two sides. And now they introduce these two ministers of the drinks. There is one palace hidden and concealed. This is on the holy side. And the minister of souls comes and opens the gate of the east and illuminates them, illuminates the souls, and gives them the life opened up by this gate of the east. And in the hand of that minister, one cup of life. And it is filled with lights. And it is called the cup of comfort, the cup of life. In the same manner, there is on the other side, in the palace of impurity, another minister, and in his hand a cup, called the cup of poison, the cup of his wrath. So the Zohar gives us an image of two palaces facing each other, and in each stands a minister at the gate holding a cup. These ministers are indistinguishable, but one holds the cup of life, and the other holds the cup of poison, facing each other, doubled, these twins who are nonetheless opponents, who are enemies. Which is which? Now we know in Purim, famously you're supposed to drink until you can't tell the difference between Haman and Mordekhai, usually understood as a commandment to get very drunk, but there's a very disturbing side to that. We live in a world where good and evil face each other. Sometimes we don't know which is which. And here in the Zohar, we have this projected out into the heavenly palaces, one of holiness, one of impurity, the divine and the demonic. Haman and Mordekhai as twins, as doubled by each other. When Haman and Mordekhai meet, they meet themselves, facing each other. It destabilizes the identity of each. And then the Zohar continues, for we have learned there is wine and there is wine, so also there is a cup and there is a cup. Identical and yet opposites. The good wine, the bad wine, the good cup, the bad cup, the good figure, the bad figure, doubled, destabilized. What of Esther? Well, Esther doesn't have a direct female counterpart in the book of Esther, perhaps Vashti, perhaps Zeresh, but not so direct as Haman and Mordekhai. Turns out in the tradition, in the Kabbalistic tradition, she's provided with a demonic other. And the first text I read is from the Raya Mehemna, a book called The Faithful Shepherd, written probably in the first decade of the 14th century, and printed in pieces within the text of the Zohar. Also written in Aramaic, but by a different author than the bulk of the Zohar. And the Raya Mehemna asks this question: do you think Achashverosh was intimate with Esther? And here we have a question that has been asked by many. How could Esther, with Mordechai's permission, go and marry King Achashverosh? What about all the prohibitions on intermarriage, on all sorts of things? This question becomes sharpened because there is an old tradition, a rabbinic tradition, that says that Esther was actually married to Mordechai. plain meaning of the text is that she was his niece, that she was his perhaps adopted daughter, but there is this tradition that she was his wife, which makes this question, do you think Achashverosh was intimate with Esther, a very, very sharp question. How could she have gone and married someone else, slept with him when she was married to Mordekhai? So the Rai Mehemna says, do you think Achashverosh was intimate with Esther? Perish the thought. And here there is a great secret. Esther is of the language of concealment. And this also goes back to rabbinic teaching in sort of a faux etymology of deriving the word Esther from the Hebrew seter, secret, and saying that she is the concealed one. The plain meaning of that is that when she was in the palace, she didn't tell the king that she was Jewish. But here we have something going on a deeper level. Esther is of the language of concealment. The Shekhinah in Kabbalah is a divine female persona. Some people would call her a goddess, who is the female consort of the principal male divine persona, the Blessed Holy One, or Kadosh Baruch Hu. So it says this: the Shekhinah concealed Esther from Achashverosh, and gave to Achashverosh a demoness in her place. And she, Esther, returned to the arms of Mordekhai. So Achashverosh didn't sleep with Esther. He slept with his demoness, who must have been identical to Esther because he couldn't tell it was a demoness. And she returned and she slept with Mordekhai, and then she would come back in the morning to Achashverosh, and he would be none the wiser. There was a demonic twin to sleep with Achashverosh. Now, so far, this sounds like apologetics. Sounds like, well, we're going to excuse one of our great heroes in the Tanakh from this sin of adultery, of marrying an un-Jew. Kinds of sins might have come up here. It sounds like apologetics. But there's something else going on here. And that something else is explained by later Kabbalists. And here we'll turn to Chaim Vital. Chaim Vital was a great 16th century Kabbalist who lived in Tzfat, who was the principal redactor, the principal writer of the teachings of the great Isaac Luria, the Ari of Tzfat. And this is from his principal book, the Sefer Eitz Chaim, the Book of the Tree of Life. Again, beginning with this teaching from the Rai Mehemna. Esther would place a demoness in her place, who would copulate with Achashverosh. So far, it's just like in the Rai Mehemna. But he goes on and says, and this is her klipa, from the dimension of evil, which is called demon. Now, the word klipa, for people who are unfamiliar, means a husk, a shell, a peel, a bark, and it is one of the main Kabbalistic terms for the demonic. There are two main Kabbalistic terms for the demonic. There's klipa, these husks which surround holiness, and the other main term is simply sitra achra, the other side. And we're going to see both of these in the course of this teaching. This is her klipa. The demoness was the klipa of Esther. It wasn't just something conjured out of nothing. It was actually the demonic side of Esther herself. And here's where things get very unsettling. The teaching seems to suggest that each person has two sides to them: their holy, divine side and their unholy, impure, demonic side called the klipa. This demoness was not just any spirit conjured up out of nothing. It was actually the demonic side of Esther herself. This is her klipa from the dimension of evil, which is called demon. And she and Mordekhai knew how to conjure the demon, her evil inclination, by means of the ineffable name, so that it would enclothe itself in the image of a body and go to Achashverosh. So Esther and Mordekhai knew Kabbalistic magic. They knew how to create a separate being from the evil side of Esther herself. So now we have Esther doubled between her divine holy side and her demonic impure side. And she would leave her demonic impure side to sleep with Achashverosh, and her holy side would go back to Mordekhai every night and then return in the morning. Things are getting very unsettling here. And Chaim Vital goes on and he says, and from that union was born Darius, the next king of Persia, the son of Esther, from the side of her demoness. And then he says, in case you didn't get it, and he was actually Esther's son, V'hu ben Esther mamash. Therefore, he was half good and half bad. So this idea, the seemingly apologetic idea from the Raya Mehemna, that Esther didn't sleep with Achashverosh, chas v'shalom, that she would sleep with this Gentile king, no, that's not what that teaching really means, Chaim Vital says. It means that she was doubled. And she managed to conduct these two relationships with her two sides. Understanding this teaching now means that we have to turn inward and look at the bifurcation, the doubling within ourselves, and how that works. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, that story did not invent this idea. The Kabbalists were there long before, and knew this notion that we are doubled, and that we have to confront that disturbing doubling within ourselves, as in the painting of Rossetti, how they met themselves. To meet yourself means to meet both sides. And now let's take it up a notch, because it turns out in the Kabbalistic tradition, this doubling is not only about humans, but also about the divine. And for that, we're going to turn to a slightly later Kabbalist, Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, the Ramchal, an Italian Kabbalist of the 18th century. And this excerpt is from his book, Kinat Hashem Tzvaot, the zealotry of God, of the Lord of hosts. And again, continuing in the same tradition from the Zohar and from Chaim Vital, both of which texts he knew very well. And he says this, and Esther is the Shekhinah. Okay, now that teaching, the notion that Esther is not just a queen of flesh and blood, but Esther is actually the divine female, the Shekhinah, that teaching is already found in the Zohar. And the Zohar reads many passages in the book of Esther as written actually about the Shekhinah herself. Listen to Moshe Chaim Luzzatto's reading of this. Esther is the Shekhinah who has been submitted to the other side. Now here we're getting very, very deeply into the most shocking aspects of Kabbalistic mythology, the notion that a part of the divine is sometimes captured by the other side, by the demonic. The other side is a name for the demonic, the Sitra Achra. Esther is the Shekhinah who has been submitted to the other side. Her marriage to Achashverosh is about the exile of the Shekhinah in the fallen world. It's not only the people of Israel who are in exile. It's not only the world that is rent by disaster and tragedy and hatreds of all kind. The divine itself is rent, is ruptured, and has been submitted to the other side. Esther is the Shekhinah who has been submitted to the other side, and Achashverosh intended to dominate her. Achashverosh here is clearly an embodiment of the demonic, perhaps Samael, the devil himself. But Mordekhai would conjure the demoness, and Achashverosh would not dominate her at all. So now we have this struggle going on, not merely among human beings, but among metaphysical beings. Esther as the Shekhinah, Achashverosh as Samael, the devil. And who is Mordekhai? Mordekhai must be the Blessed Holy One himself, as we'll see on the next slide. But just to look at this for a second, take it in. Esther is the Shekhinah who has been submitted to the other side, and Achashverosh intended to dominate her, but Mordekhai would conjure the demoness, and Achashverosh would not dominate her at all. And this demoness was the dimension of the refuse of Esther herself. Now, this is exactly the same as the teaching as in Chaim Vital, except now we're not talking about the demonic side of a human being, but the demonic side of a divine being, of the Shekhinah herself, who gives rise to her demonic other. Perhaps we can call this demonic other Lilith. And that's usually how Kabbalists refer to the demonic female counterpart of the Shekhinah. This demoness was the dimension of the refuse of Esther herself. So the Shekhinah and Lilith as two faces, two sides of the same being. And therefore, Esther would bathe and dwell in Mordekhai's breast. This is, remember, they were married, except now we're talking about, not about human beings, but about divine beings, the Shekhinah and the Blessed Holy One. This is the matter of the sexual union, the zivug that is done above in the divine realm. When she escapes from the klipot, and the she now is the Shekhinah, escapes from the klipot, escapes from demonic forces, at the time of the union of the Shekhinah with Zeir Anpin. Zeir Anpin is another name for the Kadosh Baruch Hu, the Blessed Holy One. And now the Purim story turns out to be not only about the doubling of human beings between their good and bad sides and the destabilization of their identity, but about the destabilization of the divine between good and bad sides, between the Blessed Holy One on the Shekhinah on one side and Samael, the devil, and Lilith on the other side. Things have gotten very far from a children's game with noisemakers and costumes. Well, rather, the costumes themselves prove to have this very, very unsettling implication, confronting the demonic other within ourselves, how they met themselves. Now, when I began by saying that the question of how to read the book of Esther has become very complicated in our own time, it's because we live in almost at the end of a century after the Holocaust, when the idea of the Jews being exterminated, men, women, and children, is not just simply a fairy tale in the book of Esther, but something that happened to many, many, many communities in Europe and North Africa and elsewhere, and in which there have been other genocides, unfortunately, committed since then. So it's very hard, I think, for us in the post-1945 era to simply read that as farce. We also live in an era, of course, when, as Jews, we not only are the playthings of history buffeted by forces beyond ourselves, but there is a Jewish state that exerts power. And so we live on both sides, power and powerlessness, and so forth. And then there's this very disturbing thing in the Megillah at the very end. After the decree to destroy the Jews is revoked, or actually it's not revoked, it's superseded by a second decree that allows the Jews to defend themselves. And the book tells us that in Shushan, in the capital, the Jews slew 300 of their enemies. And then it introduces this in verse 16 of chapter 9. But the other Jews that were in the king's provinces gathered and stood for their lives and slew of their foes 75,000. Now this is a surprise in the Megillah. Up until this point, we only heard, the only enemy of the Jews that we ever heard about were Haman and his family. The idea that there were thousands of people all over the country who were enemies of the Jews is something that was not introduced to the story at all until now. All of a sudden, there's a slaughter of 75,000 people. Where did this come from? What is this about? Very, very mysterious and unexplained, and quite disturbing, although usually when people read the book, by the time they get to this point, they're a little tired. They don't really notice. They just read past these 75,000 lives that have been slain. The book opens with a threat of extermination, and ends with a massacre. Now, it was probably, it says here, it was in self-defense. But that self-defense is not explained, it's not elaborated, and it sort of comes out of nowhere. Almost as though the text is saying, there's slaughter in the air here. Perhaps unmotivated slaughter by Haman. Here, perhaps self-defense, but there's slaughter in the air. Very, very disturbing. A threat to exterminate, a slaughter of 75,000 people at the end. How do we confront this kind of violence? How do we confront the other within ourselves? That is, I think, the deepest and most disturbing message or lesson that the book of Esther forces us to confront. And I want to conclude with the same image by Dante Gabriel Rossetti, how they met themselves. Right? Meeting in a wood, meeting the same who is also the other who's also the same, the demonic, which is the klipa, the husk of the divine, the klipa, which is the husk of oneself, the notion of the two faces, the princes of life and death confronting each other, almost identical. And what do we learn from that? And that is the challenge, I think, of the book of Esther and of the holiday of Purim, whose hilarity and anarchy, perhaps, one might say in Freudian terms, is overcompensation for its deeper, much more disturbing challenge to human beings, and if Kabbalah is right, also to divine beings.